Hi, welcome back. We are on our fourth video for the day. We are discussing Pushout by Monique Morris. We've covered quite a bit of material so far. I am going to be talking about dress codes and unaddressed trauma. So we're going to just go ahead and jump right in. If you've missed our first couple videos, they're all up on Facebook and they will be on the website a little bit later. So jump on in. Feel free while you're watching, join in on the discussion in the comment section. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you've read the book, if you haven't read the book, this is a topic that I think a lot of people can really engage in, even if you have not read the book yet, but I recommend it. All right, so let's go ahead and get in to our first question for this video, and that is, how are Black girls' bodies policed differently by the implementation of dress codes, and how does this impact how they feel about themselves? So before getting too deep into the specifics as how it affects Black girls, I want to address kind of the overarching issue that women face with dress codes, and that is that most dress codes throughout the United States and other places as well, but specifically here, are arbitrary. They are sexist, and they work to disproportionately affect women instead of men. And it's this idea that women hold the responsibility to preempt any type of sexual advance based that may come their way, asked for or not, welcomed or not, by what clothes they're wearing. And if you've joined us for any of these other discussions, when we've talked about rape culture, this sort of plays into that same idea. This idea that you are in some way asking for a sexual advance by the clothes you wear. So when we're talking about dress codes, this is another issue where it's putting the onus on girls and women to be able to block out any type of sexual advance based on their clothing. And, Monique Morris talks about one of the most important things to understand when we're talking about dress codes for girls is that we are not punishing girls based on boys or other girls' ability to keep their hands to themselves. So this is not, your shorts are too short, that's why someone touched you or harassed you. Now this gets even more complicated when we add in the component of race to this equation. So when you have Black girls in school, dress code becomes an even bigger issue because we have these stereotypes, like we had talked about in a few of our earlier videos, of this idea that Black women or Black girls are inherently more sexual or, oops, excuse me, my computer's making noise. They're more sexual or they're more like morally corrupt. There's this idea attached to Black girl bodies in general, which is going to make the issue of dress code even more complicated. So you add that into it, then there is an unequal application of how a lot of these dress codes are put into place when it comes to Black girls. And I know Brittany touched on this briefly. This is something that these girls are aware of. It does not miss, they do not miss this idea that, a Black girl may be wearing the same, there's an example in the book, and she talks about going into the office, this girl, and she has a pair of shorts on, and she's told to go home. And another girl walks into the office, a white girl, who has on the same shorts, and she's allowed to continue on to class. And this sense of injustice, or that somehow my body is wrong or bad inherently because of what it looks like. So there is an unequal application of dress codes, which happens very regularly and to the detriment of Black girls quite often, which makes them increasingly difficult. And it's not just, oh, you're in trouble. This contributes to the pushing out of girls from school, even when you have uniform policies. So she talks about, maybe uniforms. We think this is a way to get around the dress code issue. And then you have girls being sent home because they don't have the right color belt or they have the wrong color shoes on, despite the fact these may be the only shoes she has. Or is it really worth putting a student out of school, having them miss their learning environment, like miss this chance to be in their learning environment, simply because of what they're wearing? And she talks in the end about how we can address this in a different way, where we're talking about what is the most important thing? It's not about what these students are wearing. It's about, are they showing up ready to learn? Are they able to learn in this environment? And focusing so much on what these girls are wearing buys into the idea that they are sexualized beings. They are children. If it's too sexy for a 12-year-old to be wearing a low-cut shirt or shorts, the problem isn't with the 12-year-old. It's the fact that we are talking about this child as if she is an adult, instead of holding accountable the people that would sexualize her. We also have this idea of the male gaze, the sexual gaze, and she talks to some of the girls in her book about this, and every single one of them could relate to or recount a story of feeling sexualized or looked at, that feeling of they want me, not in a good way, even from teachers or other adults in their lives from a very young age. And this idea of policing their bodies and policing their dress code in this way goes to reinforce this idea for the girls themselves. They're not unaware of this. They can feel that sort of energy, and it ends up making them feel like they've brought this on themselves. There's something wrong with their bodies, especially when there's an unequal application of the dress code. Something is inherently wrong with you because of who you are. So we continue to look at this as a way to exclude Black girls from the classroom. It's just another tool that's being used to push them out. On page 214, which is towards the end of the book, Dr. Morris has different ways to sort of handle different problems and recommendations. And she writes, dress codes, as I have addressed early in this book, function to stigmatize girls and undermine their ability to attend class. Schools should work with their students to construct what is appropriate dress for school. You know, a lot of these girls think too about clothes are a way that we express ourselves, and so the same dress code's not going to work everywhere, and trying to be reasonable about that and working with the students, Dr. Morris says, is one way that we can build dress codes that are actually working for the students and not against them. Okay, so the next question is, what consequence does unaddressed trauma have on Black girls in schools? How can schools be more responsive to girls with trauma and create a safe learning space for them? So I know this is something we've touched on a little bit earlier as well, is this idea that so many of these girls are coming to school with a whole host of other things that are going on in their lives. They're not just showing up there and nothing else is happening. Some of these girls are facing abuse at home, there's drug issues, some of them have been pulled into sex trafficking, and so they have all mental illness that's not addressed. So there's this whole host of issues that you bring with you every day, and then to expect you to be able to sit down, focus, learn, and have no problems is really misguided and short-sighted, and is putting these girls at a disadvantage. So by not recognizing all the other host of issues that people have with them when they show up to a space, that's where we end up simply focusing on punishment and pushing them out rather than addressing why these things are happening. So she looks at one girl in particular. Her name was Jennifer, and she had been bounced around to different foster homes. She didn't have a lot of money. She ended up being sex trafficked, and at some point she went missing and no one noticed. The school didn't contact her foster parents. There's this idea that they just disappear and no one asks any questions, and that some part of that is educators and administrators are overwhelmed. They're not trained. When they do see these things going on, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to handle it, which needs to be addressed. We need to get more in there. But also, we're not valuing these girls. So when they're gone, there's not someone that's saying, this is wrong. What happened to her? And there is a quote on page 106, and this is from Jennifer. And this is one of those moments that was both extremely difficult to read, but also very powerful. And it says, and this is a quote from Jennifer, it says, "I got into prostitution because the guy that raped me, he forced me on the track. Basically, I didn't go willingly at first, but ever since he did that to me, my whole life just changed, and that was at 12 years old. Ever since then, my life's been off track." Morris writes, "She spoke words with such direct honesty that I suspected she had told this story before. Her youth was obscured by a very painful and complicated past." So here we have a 12-year-old who drops out of school in 7th grade, who is pushed into selling her body, and it's not being addressed, and you expect her to be able to somehow still operate in a normal school environment, which is just not going to happen. We also have this problem for Black girls in particular, where we talk about seeing them as making these choices, and that comes partly from age compression, where we're putting Black girls into a space where we see them as adults. There is no such thing as prostitution when you're 12. You are not a prostitute. You are 12. You can't even legally consent to sex. And I think that sometimes that is missed. These girls end up, consequences of not having this addressed or no one noticing what's going on. These girls run into the criminal legal system as a result. They end up being ridiculed oftentimes by their peers and administrators. There's this idea that she's just a bad girl, or somehow that this sexualized child has made a choice to become a part of this sex trafficking, this sex trade, that this is a lifetime choice she's made. And despite what words some of these girls speak as if it's by choice, but remembering that they're children, and sometimes that language can be self-preservation, it can be confusion about the systems that they are part of. So other consequences for not addressing this trauma: it can lead to them being pushed out of the schools entirely due to bad behavior, willful defiance, fighting. Not addressing any of those other behavioral issues can end up putting them on the streets. It can lead to unintended pregnancies. This idea when they need money, a lot of times if you're pushed out and you don't have anything else to do, so they find themselves selling their bodies. And, there's this idea that can happen now, and these are children, so they go into survival mode and they're not able to see sort of the long-term consequences. So a lot of the girls that she talked with, when she asked them, what would it take? So they have all of this compact and complex situations that they're dealing with. And so she asks them, what would it take for you to be able to stay in school? What would make this an environment that worked for you? How could we address you in a better way? And one of the things they talked about was more attention. So they're aware that they're not getting attention, not even any attention to anyone, but less attention than their white peers in often cases. Being able to ask questions. And the most important thing was having someone they could trust. Having someone, whether it was a counselor or a teacher, someone they could go to and talk to several times a week, to let go of some of these things that they're carrying around. They're not able to focus when these things are unaddressed, whether it is the sex trafficking or mental health or any other host of issues. Some of them, Brittany talked about an experience when she was talking about this permission to fail. The girl was hungry. She was tired and she was hungry. So when we're not addressing the root of the problem, we're not actually taking care of these girls, and we are not giving them a quality education. We're not giving them a chance. On page 119, Monique writes, as women and girls become more sexualized in the world, the more they are seen as property. And this is kind of this idea throughout the book. We're not looking at them as people. We're not looking at them as children. They are property. They just need to conform. They need to be punished or gotten rid of if they can't fall in line. And when you're not looking at the trauma that these girls bring with them, and you're not looking at the full picture, you're not able to fully educate them. And it makes it a very toxic and dangerous situation for so many of these girls. Brittany's going to get into a few more of like, how can we make changes? How can we learn to provide a better environment for these girls? But one of the things that's going to be really important when addressing trauma is this idea of more resources. In that article I referenced in my first video about the DC school who had lost such a huge portion of their teachers, one of the teachers that had left was interviewed, and they were asking her, like, why? Why would you leave in the middle of the year when you know your students? And one of the things she talked about was that she knew her students needed more, and she just couldn't do it. She didn't have the support. She didn't have the resources. She didn't have the training. She's like, I knew that these students needed more and I couldn't give it to them. And at some point, it can be overwhelming for even those that are trying to provide it for these students. So we as a society have to decide that there is value in providing these things so that they are available for the educators and the teachers to give to these students, to learn to talk to them, listen to them. So many of these girls wanted to be heard. They wanted to be seen and recognized and heard. They asked for having people who had had experiences like them. It's very hard to feel safe and open when you're going through so many of the traumas that they're going through, whether it be abuse or sexual abuse or sex trafficking. Having someone that you really feel safe talking to and not judged. And so a lot of times having someone maybe who had been there or had experienced something similar to them that was now on the other side could give them a safe place to talk to and figure out a way to get out of this. And Dr. Morris talks that it is something these girls can get off the streets. These girls can find ways to have a better life, but not on their own. That is very difficult. It's something that is not easy to do alone. So if we don't address the trauma, if we don't get to the root of the problem, we're simply just criminalizing these girls. And they're not going to be able to learn. They're not going to be able to just fall in line. And as we've seen, all of these issues play one on top of another. It is a system. It is not something that is individualized as far as you fix one thing and it's all going to be better. There is no easy answer for this, but it has to be something that's addressed and continuously. So that is the end of my last video. Brittany's got one more coming to you. There's going to be some talk about what do we do? Where do we go from here? What are some of the recommendations? And I think you're going to really want it. It's going to be a great wrap-up of today's discussion, so don't miss Brittany. She'll be on at 4 o'clock. Thank you all for joining, and comment. I want to know what you guys are thinking, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.